In August 1948, a twin-engine Beechcraft took off from McCall, Idaho, with 8 wooden crates strapped down in the cargo hold. Inside those crates were 76 live beavers. The plane climbed to roughly 700 feet above the Chamberlain Basin, a remote valley in the mountains of central Idaho, and one by one the crates were pushed out the door. Each one had a parachute stitched to the top. Each one held animals that had never seen the sky from above, let alone fallen from it. By the time the operation was over, 75 beavers had touched down in one of the wildest, most inaccessible valleys in the American West, and the ecological experiment that followed would run, uninterrupted, for the next 77 years. Today, that landscape sits inside the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness, one of the largest protected wilderness areas in the lower 48 United States. It covers 2.3 million acres of mountain, river, and forest. No roads cross it, no vehicles enter it. And within it, the descendants of those 1948 beavers have been doing what beavers do: building dams, felling trees, creating ponds, reshaping watersheds for more than 7 decades, with almost no human interference at all. What they built in that valley is something researchers today describe as one of the most significant unintentional ecosystem restoration experiments in American history. But almost nobody knows the full story, how it happened, why it worked, and what the landscape looks like now. This is that story. This is the full story, from the post-war housing boom that forced Idaho into an impossible wildlife problem, to the single-state biologist who solved it with surplus World War II equipment and a test beaver named Geronimo, to the 77-year rewilding experiment that has unfolded in silence inside one of America's last great wilderness areas. Most videos about the parachuting beavers show the grainy 1948 footage and call it a curiosity, a quirky moment from the past. This one follows the actual data, 77 years deep, into the survival rates, the crate engineering, the scientific paper that documented every detail, the wilderness designation that sealed the valley off in 1980, and the modern research that is only now revealing what beavers do to a landscape when you give them 70 decades and no human interference. Every claim in this video is sourced from the original 1950 scientific paper published by Idaho Fish and Game Warden Elmo W. Heater in the Journal of Wildlife Management. The Idaho Department of Fish and Game's official archival film from 1948, peer-reviewed research from Stanford University and the Brazier Beaver Ecosystem Engineering Review, and NASA Earth Observatory imagery of the Frank Church Wilderness. This is not speculation. This is what the scientific record actually documents. But before you can understand what those beavers did in Idaho, you need to understand why a government agency in 1948 decided the only way to save a species was to throw them out of an airplane. The North American beaver, scientific name Castor canadensis, is not a cute woodland creature. It is an ecosystem engineer on a scale almost no other animal on the continent can match. An adult beaver weighs between 35 and 70 pounds, roughly the size of a medium dog. It has self-sharpening orange incisors, tinted orange by high iron content in the enamel, that grow continuously throughout the animal's life and can fell hardwood trees more than a foot in diameter. Its tail is a broad flat paddle used for steering underwater, warning other beavers of danger with thunderous slaps on the surface, and storing fat for winter. It can hold its breath underwater for up to 15 minutes. Its dense waterproof fur is so effective that beavers were the primary driver of the North American fur trade for more than 2 centuries. Beavers live in extended family groups, a breeding pair, the current year's kits, and typically 1 or 2 older offspring who stay with the parents until they reach breeding age at about 2 years old. They are monogamous and mate for life. They navigate not with sight, which is relatively poor, but with acute senses of smell and hearing that allow them to detect running water from remarkable distances, a critical ability because the sound of flowing water is what triggers their dam-building instinct in the first place. Place a speaker playing the sound of running water in a dry field, and a beaver will pile sticks on top of it. That is not a joke. It is a documented behavioral response that scientists have used in studies of beaver decision-making. But here is what makes the beaver irreplaceable. It does not just live in a river, it builds the river. A single beaver colony can fell thousands of trees over decades, raise water levels by several feet through dam construction, flood acres of land, create wetlands where streams used to flow, and establish habitat for dozens of other species that could not exist there without them. Fish, amphibians, waterfowl, invertebrates, moose, elk, and even migratory birds depend on the wetlands that beavers maintain. Scientists have documented that beaver wetlands store enormous quantities of water during wet seasons and release it slowly during droughts, regulating stream flow across entire watersheds. The landscape that European settlers first encountered in North America was, to a large degree, a landscape shaped by beavers. Later in this video, you will see what those same capabilities produced in the Chamberlain Basin over 77 undisturbed years. The scale of what happened is unlike almost any other ecological story in North America. But first, how America almost lost these animals in the first place. When you remove an ecosystem engineer like the beaver from a continent, you do not just lose a species, you lose every wetland process that depended on them. And North America lost those processes deliberately. Before European colonization, beaver populations across the continent were estimated at somewhere between 60 and 400 million animals. Their dams and ponds covered hundreds of thousands of square miles. Then, beginning in the 1600s and accelerating for the next 250 years, the fur trade drove a coordinated hunting effort that hunters themselves sometimes called a mammalian gold rush. By 1900, the North American beaver population had collapsed to an estimated 100,000 animals, down from hundreds of millions. The species teetered on the edge of extinction. The economic force driving the collapse was beaver felt. European hat makers had developed a technique for processing beaver underfur into a material of exceptional smoothness and water resistance, ideal for hats. A single pelt could command prices rivaling precious metals by weight. Entire colonial economies, New France, the Oregon Country, and large sections of the American interior were mapped and settled along the logic of where the beavers still were. When the beavers in one region ran out, the trappers pushed west. The fur trade was, in effect, the first continent-scale extractive industry in American history, and its currency was a rodent. The collapse was not just a wildlife tragedy, it was a hydrological catastrophe. Without beaver dams to slow water and store it across the landscape, streams cut deeper, faster channels. Floodplains dried out. Water tables dropped. Wetlands that had stored incalculable volumes of water disappeared. Rivers that had once meandered through networks of beaver ponds became narrow, eroded ditches. Across the American West in particular, landscapes that had been moist, productive, and biologically diverse became drier, harder, and ironically, given the common assumption that arid landscapes are natural, much less able to sustain life. By the 1930s, the scale of the ecological disaster had become too obvious to ignore. The United States Department of the Interior began relocating beavers back into parts of their historic range starting in 1936. The economic case was stark. The cost of relocating a single beaver was about $8, while the estimated value of a beaver's hydrological work, including water storage, erosion control, and wetland creation, was calculated at around $300 per beaver over its lifetime. In today's money, that's a return of roughly 36 times the initial investment, produced entirely by an animal no one had to pay. What Idaho did next would take years of experimentation, require the solving of a problem that had killed hundreds of relocation candidates, and depend on the inventiveness of one state wildlife officer who had access to a huge surplus of World War II equipment and a willingness to use it in ways nobody had ever tried. It almost did not happen. After World War II ended in 1945, Idaho experienced a surge of post-war migration. Veterans and their families moved from the cities to the rural valleys of the state's southwest, particularly around the resort town of McCall and Payette Lake. The new development ran directly into the territory of expanding beaver populations that had been slowly recovering for a decade. Residents began complaining about beaver dams flooding roads and pastures. Beavers were cutting down ornamental trees in yards. Irrigation canals were being blocked. The Idaho Department of Fish and Game was getting more calls every week, and the answer they had been using for a decade, trap the beavers and move them somewhere else, was becoming impossible to execute at scale. The traditional relocation method was, in the Heta paper's own phrase, arduous, prolonged, expensive, and resulted in high mortality. Trappers would capture beavers in box traps near the complaint site. The animals would be loaded onto a truck and driven to a conservation officer's location. Then, because the destination sites were far out in the backcountry, the beavers would be transferred to horses or mules. Because beavers are semi-aquatic animals adapted to cool water, being strapped onto a sweating horse and carried through hot summer forests for hours at a time was physiologically devastating. The beavers overheated. They became stressed to the point of refusing to eat. Many died during the transport itself. The ones that survived arrived at the release site weakened, disoriented, and far more likely to die in the first weeks after release. The entire system was failing. The man who solved the problem was Elmo W. Heater, a regional conservation officer for the Idaho Department of Fish and Game. Heater had looked at the logistical nightmare of mule-based beaver transport, and he had noticed something. The Chamberlain Basin, where the beavers were supposed to go, was accessible by small aircraft. After World War II, the United States military had left behind enormous stockpiles of surplus parachutes. They were available cheaply, and Heater realized they were not being used. His proposal, later published in full in the Journal of Wildlife Management in 1950, was simple in concept and precise in execution. Capture the beavers near civilization. Load them into specially designed wooden crates. Fly them to the Chamberlain Basin in a small airplane. Push the crates out the door with parachutes attached. Design the crates so they will automatically open when they hit the ground. Let the beavers walk out, find water, and start doing what beavers do. The design of the crate itself was the critical engineering problem. Heater tested multiple designs. Early prototypes either failed to open on landing, trapping the animals inside, or opened prematurely in the air, which was catastrophic. One early design used a willow twig basket that was supposed to weaken as the beaver chewed through it, but field tests showed the beavers would simply wait, confused, instead of chewing their way out on cue. Another design used a timer release mechanism that added weight and cost without improving reliability. Heater spent weeks iterating, dropping empty boxes, then weighted boxes, then boxes with live animals from various heights, measuring impact forces and testing the spring action of different elastic configurations. The final version was built from two lidless wooden boxes hinged together like a suitcase, with breathing holes drilled in the sides. Inside each box, 2 beavers could be transported. Typically, 1 male and 3 females were split across 2 crates, because field experience had shown that younger beavers in small family groups had higher survival rates than older solitary animals. The crates measured 30 inches by 12 inches by 8 inches. The parachutes were attached at the top. And here was the key. Innovation. Heavy 2-inch elastic bands were fastened to the bottom of the box and stretched up the sides, acting as springs. Ropes held the 2 halves shut during flight. When the crate hit the ground, the impact would snap the ropes, and the elastic bands would automatically force the crate open, allowing the beaver to walk free without any human intervention. No one would need to approach the landing site to open the box. Before the operation could be approved for full transport, Heater needed to test the system. That required a test beaver. His name was Geronimo. What happened next took just a few test flights, but it produced one of the most peculiar photographs in the history of American wildlife management. Geronimo, named somewhat inaccurately after the Apache war leader, was an older male beaver, Heater, selected for the initial drop tests. He was loaded into a prototype crate. The crate was taken up in a small plane. Then, from about 500 feet, Geronimo was pushed out the door. Geronimo survived. The crate landed. The springs worked. The box opened. Geronimo walked out. Hector put him back in the crate and did it again. Over the course of the testing phase, Geronimo was parachuted multiple times from varying altitudes. Each time, he survived. Each time, the mechanism worked. By the end of the tests, Hector described Geronimo as being so accustomed to the process that he would voluntarily crawl back into the crate for the next flight. The old beaver had become, essentially, a one-animal proof for an entirely new branch of wildlife management. When the full operation was finally approved, Geronimo was given the honor of being included in the first flight. His reward, after repeated service as the test subject, was a one-way ticket to the Chamberlain Basin and a permanent retirement among 3 young female beavers selected to accompany him. On August 14, 1948, the full operation began. The twin-engine Beechcraft took off from McCall with 8 crates of beavers, a pilot, and a conservation officer on board. Over the following days, 76 beavers were parachuted into selected meadows across the Chamberlain Basin. The drop altitude was between 500 and 800 feet, high enough for the parachutes to fully deploy, and low enough to keep the descent time short and reduce stress on the animals. Conservation officers had consulted with the Idaho State Fur Supervisor to select specific meadow sites based on water availability, vegetation cover, and distance from the nearest existing beaver colonies. The survival rate was extraordinary. 75 of the 76 beavers landed safely and walked out of their crates. The only casualty was a single beaver that forced its way out of the crate during the fall. It escaped the box mid-air and fell to its death. Every other animal survived the drop itself, and critically, they survived in good enough physiological condition to immediately begin doing what beavers do. The total cost of the operation, according to Hector's detailed accounting, was between $8 and $16 per beaver, including aircraft fuel, surplus parachute purchase, crate construction, and personnel time. That translates to roughly $190 to $380 per beaver in $2,025. Compared to the traditional mule transport method, which took days per animal, killed a significant fraction of the animals in transit, and required continuous human labor, the parachute method was dramatically cheaper and dramatically more effective. But the biggest surprise was not the survival rate. It was what the surviving beavers started doing in the valley below. In 1949, Idaho Fish and Game conducted follow-up surveys at the drop sites. The beavers had not scattered, they had not wandered aimlessly, they had not been killed by predators in unusual numbers. Instead, within months of landing in a valley none of them had ever seen before, they had begun constructing dams on the small streams flowing through their new territory. By the time surveyors reached the release sites, there were already pond systems forming. Lodges were being built. The animals had resumed their engineering behavior as if nothing had happened, as if they had simply moved house, not fallen out of the sky. There is a specific reason this worked. Beaver dam construction is not learned behavior in the ordinary sense. It is largely innate, triggered by environmental cues, the sound of running water, the presence of woody vegetation, the topography of the stream channel. Adult beavers carry the full instinct set. Drop an adult beaver into a suitable habitat, and within days, the animal will begin identifying choke points in the stream, felling nearby saplings, and constructing a dam at roughly the same location a different beaver would have chosen. This is why the Chamberlain Basin operation worked where many other translocation projects, involving animals that had to learn complex social or hunting behaviors from their natal environment, have struggled. The beavers did not need to be taught what to do. They already knew. The operation was declared a success. Popular Mechanics magazine published a feature on the project in 1949, coining the nickname Para Beavers for the transplanted animals. The Idaho Department of Fish and Game filmed the operation in black and white footage that would later be stored, misclassified, and lost for 65 years before being rediscovered in 2015 by Sharon Clark, an Idaho fish and game historian who recognized what she was looking at. The film was digitized and uploaded to YouTube. Time magazine declared the beavers the internet's latest favorite animal. But all of that, the press coverage, the Popular Mechanics article, the rediscovered film, is surface. It is the story everyone knows. What almost nobody talks about is what those beavers did in the decades after the drop, in a valley that was about to become one of the most protected wilderness areas in the United States. And that is where the story gets truly remarkable. Because in 1980, the entire Chamberlain Basin, along with 2.3 million acres of surrounding mountain, forest, and canyon, was officially designated as the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness. The designation, signed into law by President Jimmy Carter, is one of the strictest forms of land protection in the United States. No roads, no motorized vehicles, no permanent human structures, no logging, no mining, no development. The only humans allowed inside are those who walk in on foot or ride in on horseback or raft in down the Salmon River, the river that gave the wilderness its nickname, the River of No Return. The designation was not created with the beavers in mind. Senator Frank Church, the Idaho Democrat whose name the wilderness now carries, spent much of his career fighting for the protection of Idaho's backcountry against logging and dam building pressures, and the 1980 designation was the culmination of that decades-long effort. The beavers were, from the perspective of the politicians who drew the boundaries, invisible, just part of the scenery. But the legal protection that Church secured for the watershed above them would turn out to be the single most important factor in the ecological experiment that no one realized was running. What that means ecologically is almost unique in the modern world. It means that the Chamberlain Basin has now spent 77 years with a steadily expanding beaver population and essentially zero direct human interference. The beavers have done what beavers do. They fell trees, build dams, create ponds, and expand their territory for 3/4 of a century in a landscape where no one comes to clear the dams, no one traps the animals for fur, no one builds roads through the wetlands they create, and no one drains their ponds for agricultural land. This is the control experiment that modern beaver science has never been able to run. Every other beaver restoration project in North America operates in landscapes where humans actively manage, disturb, or remove the animals' work. The Frank Church Wilderness shows what happens when you let beavers do their thing, on their own schedule, at their own scale, for multiple generations. And that is where the story gets genuinely interesting. Because what the descendants of those 75 parachuted beavers have built is an example of what scientists now call landscape-scale beaver ecology, the accumulated effect of beaver engineering over time periods long enough for entire watersheds to change character. A 2021 review paper on beaver ecosystem engineering by Brazier and colleagues in the journal Wires documented this effect across multiple beaver systems globally. Where beavers are allowed to work at scale over decades, they produce measurable changes in water storage, flood attenuation, drought resilience, sediment retention, water quality improvement, and biodiversity increases across multiple taxonomic groups. A 2025 research synthesis from Stanford University, published on the Stanford News platform, documented the role of beaver-engineered landscapes in climate resilience, specifically their capacity to hold water in watersheds during increasingly frequent drought years and to slow flood flows during increasingly intense storm events. The first surprise was hydrological. The Brazier review documented that individual beaver dam systems can store tens of thousands of cubic meters of water in their ponds, and that networks of dams across a watershed can raise groundwater tables for kilometers around the immediate pond sites. In the Frank Church Wilderness, aerial surveys and NASA Earth Observatory imagery have documented wetland expansion across the basin over decades, exactly the signature of long-term beaver engineering operating without interruption. The 1948 release sites are now surrounded by wetland complexes that did not exist when the parachutes came down. The process is cumulative and self-reinforcing. A single dam traps sediment, raises the streambed, and spreads water into the floodplain. The water table rises. Willows, alders, and aspens colonize the wet zones, the same species beavers feed on and build with. The colony grows. New dams go up, and the process repeats. Over decades, what began as a single pond becomes a chain of connected wetlands stretching for miles along the valley bottom. That is what 7 decades of uninterrupted beaver work looks like from the air. And that was only the hydrological surprise. What the beavers did to the forest itself was something else entirely. Beaver-created wetlands are biodiversity hotspots. When a beaver builds a dam and creates a pond, dozens of other species follow. Amphibians colonize the new breeding habitat. Waterfowl use the ponds as nesting and feeding sites. Fish populations, including salmon and trout, which are critical species throughout the Columbia River Basin, benefit from the deeper, cooler pool habitat created behind beaver dams, especially during summer low-flow periods when free-flowing streams become too warm for young fish to survive. Moose and elk browse on the vegetation that grows in and around beaver ponds. Songbird populations increase in the thickened willow and alder stands that regrow in areas beavers have opened. Even insect diversity, the foundation of most freshwater food webs, rises substantially in beaver-engineered reaches. There is a specific effect beavers have on salmon that is worth pausing on, because it directly connects the Chamberlain Basin to the broader health of the Pacific Northwest. The streams flowing out of the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness eventually drain into the Salmon River, which drains into the Snake, which drains into the Columbia. Chinook and steelhead salmon that spawn in the upper reaches of these watersheds are born in the cold gravel-bottomed streams of central Idaho, migrate more than 900 miles to the Pacific Ocean, and then return years later to spawn in the exact streams where they hatched. Beaver ponds along these streams provide cold water refuges during summer heat waves, slow water habitat for juvenile salmon learning to feed, and nutrient-rich environments that support the entire salmonid food web. In a region where wild salmon populations have declined catastrophically over the last century, beavers are not a sentimental addition. They are infrastructure. The Chamberlain Basin, after 77 years of uninterrupted beaver activity, has become what researchers would now consider a near-reference ecosystem, a landscape functioning close to the way it would have functioned before European contact. That is an almost impossibly rare thing to find in North America in 2025. And the people who made it possible were an Idaho state biologist in the 1940s with a parachute design problem, his test beaver Geronimo, and the United States Congress that protected the valley before anyone fully understood what was happening inside it. The full dimensions of that transformation are still being quantified. Unlike the Scottish Beaver Trial or the Irish Eagle Project, the Chamberlain Basin was never set up as a long-term monitoring study. The 1948 operation was a relocation program designed to solve an immediate property damage problem, not a scientific experiment. That means there is no continuous dataset tracking the beaver's descendants over 77 years. What we know is drawn from piecewise evidence, field surveys conducted decades apart, satellite imagery, broader peer-reviewed research on beaver ecology applied to the specific Idaho landscape, and the basic biological reality that 75 beavers, given 77 years of protection and no predation beyond what evolved naturally, will build a lot of dams. But the direction is clear, and the direction has enormous implications for the American West right now. The third surprise was climatological. In 2025, as the American West faces increasingly severe droughts, more intense wildfires, earlier snowmelt, and more erratic river flows, scientists are turning back to beavers not as a curiosity, but as a tool. The 2025 Stanford research and multiple parallel studies have documented that beaver-engineered landscapes are among the most resilient freshwater ecosystems in North America. Wetlands created by beavers act as natural fire breaks, because the saturated soils and dense vegetation simply do not burn the way dried-out forests do. Ponds store water through hot, dry summers, maintaining flow in streams that would otherwise go dry. Cooler water temperatures behind dams create refuges for cold water fish during heat waves. And beaver dams trap and process sediment and nutrients, improving water quality downstream. The firebreak effect has taken on particular urgency in recent years. Wildfires across the American West have become larger, hotter, and more frequent, driven by climate change and decades of fire suppression policy that allowed fuel loads in dry forests to build up to dangerous levels. In multiple recent megafires, investigators and satellite imagery have documented that beaver-engineered wetlands acted as fire refugia, green wet patches in a burned landscape where vegetation survived, wildlife sheltered, and the fire either slowed or stopped entirely. A beaver pond does not just hold water. In a burning forest, it holds life. What this means is that the 1948 parachute operation, conceived as a way to solve a property damage problem in rural Idaho, accidentally produced something much larger. It established a population of ecosystem engineers in a valley that would become federally protected wilderness. And those engineers have spent 3/4 of a century building exactly the kind of climate-resilient watershed that modern science is now trying to create on purpose everywhere it can. The beavers parachuted into the Chamberlain Basin did not know they were solving a climate problem. They did not know they were producing the kind of reference ecosystem that researchers would later study as a model. They were just doing what beavers do: felling trees, building dams, creating ponds, raising families, expanding territory. But because they were given a landscape large enough to work at scale and a time frame long enough for their engineering to compound, the result is one of the most successful unintentional rewilding stories in the history of North American conservation. In 2015, the rediscovered film of the 1948 drops went viral online. Parachuting beavers became a cultural icon in Idaho. A Boise brewery changed its logo to a parachuting beaver. A local baseball team rebranded as the Battle Beavers in 2025. Elmo W. Hitter's 1950 scientific paper became one of the most shared wildlife management documents on the internet. The story, once forgotten, became everywhere. But the real story, the one that matters, is not the falling crates or the test beaver named Geronimo or the black and white film. The real story is what 76 animals and their descendants did to 2.3 million acres of American wilderness when nobody was paying attention. The real story is what 7 decades of uninterrupted beaver engineering looks like from a satellite. The real story is the 1948 Idaho Fish and Game Warden who looked at a shortage of mules and a surplus of parachutes and decided, against every professional instinct, to throw beavers out of an airplane, and in doing so accidentally created one of the great ecosystem restoration experiments of the 20th century. Elmo Hitter never lived to see his work reappraised. He died decades before the 2015 film Rediscovery brought his operation to global attention, decades before climate researchers would begin citing beaver-engineered landscapes as models for watershed resilience, decades before the animals he dropped into a remote valley would become one of the strongest arguments for large-scale beaver reintroduction across the American West. What he knew at the time was that his method worked, that it was cheap, and that the beavers survived the fall. What he did not know, what he could not have known, was that the ecological compound interest of his 1948 operation would still be paying out in 2025. 76 beavers. 1 airplane. Surplus World War II parachutes, a test beaver named Geronimo, a valley in central Idaho that would become a federally protected wilderness area 22 years later, and a population of ecosystem engineers that is now writing its own future across the Chamberlain Basin, still building, still expanding, still reshaping one of the last great wild landscapes in the continental United States, 77 years after the first crate hit the ground. But Idaho is not the only place where a returned species is reshaping a landscape in ways scientists did not predict. In our next video, we go to Scotland, where 11 beavers were released into a forest that had not seen them in more than 4 centuries. And what 11 animals built in 5 years will change what you think is possible in rewilding. If you thought 76 parachuting beavers were insane, Wait until you see what 11 beavers can do to a watershed when you give them half a decade and complete scientific monitoring. You will not look at ecosystem recovery the same way again.